Buenas tardes. Vamos a dar comienzo a este acto de presentación del libro de Guy Standing, Precariado, una carta de derechos. Bien, quiero agradecer a Guy Standing que en fin, haya aceptado la invitación. Luego diré lo muy agradecido que estoy por la agenda tan apretada que tiene. A Íñigo, le cabría decir exactamente lo mismo, y a Jorge muy especialmente, porque en un principio estaba prevista la asistencia de Tania Sánchez, pero en una reunión excusable pues, ha hecho que no pueda venir, y Jorge amablemente pues, y in extremis pues, ha aceptado la sustitución, ¿no? Bien, bueno, Guy Standing es una figura ahora de proyección mundial y tiene muchas dimensiones, ¿no? Tiene una dimensión de activista muy clara. Por ejemplo, es miembro cofundador de la Basic Income Earth Network, es decir, la red mundial de la renta básica. Pero más allá de esto es un académico de mucho prestigio, y yo creo que por lo que todo el mundo finalmente terminará recordando a Guy Standing es por su aportación científico positiva, ¿no? Y muy señaladamente por sus dos últimas grandes obras, la última de las cuales, esta, acabamos de traducir al castellano. Bien, yo diría que en el panorama bibliográfico, un 99,9% de los libros son totalmente prescindibles. Es una de las desgracias, ¿no? Luego hay una minoría de libros buenos, una minoría después todavía más pequeña de libros muy buenos. Y luego ya vamos subiendo, ¿no?, el escalafón de la excelencia intelectual y nos encontramos con libros importantes. Pues bien, yo diría que hay todavía un escalón superior, que es el de los libros centrales. Pues bien, yo creo que este, sinceramente, es un libro central. ¿Cuándo un libro es central? Bien, cuando, siendo o suponiendo una aportación sustantiva y sólida, es un libro que marca un antes y un después, es un libro que fija, en definitiva y sustantivamente, un debate. Yo recuerdo que, en fin, un filósofo conservador, pero gran filósofo, Robert Nozick, se quejaba antes de morir. ¿Can you follow? Se quejaba antes de morir de que ya no había libros centrales. Estos libros que toda la academia y la sociedad civil ilustrada corría a hacerse con ellos porque surgía la necesidad de aclararse sobre lo que este libro planteaba. Por poner un ejemplo, en los años 70 hubo un libro que supuso una revolución en el panorama filosófico político, el libro de John Rawls, ¿no? O sea, la filosofía política antes de Rawls es una cosa, después de Rawls es otra. Y todo el mundo, economistas, psicólogos, filósofos, historiadores incluso, tuvieron la necesidad de aclararse sobre A Theory of Justice de John Rawls, ¿no? Pues yo creo que, con todas las diferencias entre el libro de Standing y el de John Rawls, son libros que, desde el punto de vista, digamos, político-académico, cumplen funciones parecidas. Y los dos son el resultado de una decantación de años de trabajo más anónimo, más lento, acumulativo, como es el caso de estos libros sobre el precariado, ¿no? Guy Standing pues, se ha pasado 30 años, bueno, para ser más exactos, 31 años trabajando en la Organización Internacional del Trabajo, tiene toda una larga serie de aportaciones importantes desde, por decirlo muy generalmente, con mucha generalidad, desde la economía del trabajo, y al final, resultado de toda esa decantación, de esa acumulación de saber, y de esa investigación multilateral que él desarrolla desde esta organización, pues es este trabajo, ¿no? Además, el libro es la diferencia fundamental con el primero del precariado, pues tiene una dimensión explícita e inmediatamente política. O sea, él no se conforma con el diagnóstico, el análisis de una realidad de la que, en fin, tendremos ocasión de hablar, que es la emergencia de una nueva clase, que es el precariado, a nivel global, sino que da un paso más y propone, recuperando la tradición, la mejor tradición cartista inglesa, propone una agenda política en un articulado de 29 artículos, ¿no? Muy variada, que él dice explícitamente que no es ni exhaustiva ni excluyente, pero que desde luego es un magnífico punto de partida para la discusión, ¿no? Prueba de que este es un libro realmente central, como decía, o sea, forma parte de esta élite exigua de libros, es que su proyección mundial ha sido espectacular. Me venía contando en el coche, cuando le he ido a recoger del hotel, que ha hecho, corrígeme si no he retenido bien el dato, ha hecho 300 presentaciones desde el 2011 en 33 países distintos. El libro El precariado se ha traducido ya a 14 lenguas diferentes y que prácticamente acaba de salir, me pasé todo el verano traduciéndolo, en fin, sin hacer prácticamente otra cosa, para en fin, que tuviera salida, porque me parecía importante. Ya ha sido traducido a 4 lenguas distintas, ¿no? Entonces, bueno, esto también es un indicador de la importancia objetiva, ¿no?, del libro. En fin, el poner el dedo en la llaga de un problema como el del precariado, cuidado, el precariado no como un fenómeno exótico, un fenómeno marginal, un fenómeno que podríamos ubicar en el tercer mundo, en la periferia de la economía del mundo capitalista. No. El haber insistido en que este es un fenómeno global que afecta no solo a esa periferia, sino allá al núcleo, a la metrópoli de este sistema de gran capitalismo globalizado, pues es otro de los hallazgos del libro, ¿no? Bien, lo del precariado no solamente no es una cuestión exótica, sino que tampoco es una realidad, digamos, estrictamente académica. El precariado es una realidad que marca, desde mi punto de vista, o señala a uno de los grandes problemas que tiene planteado el mundo desde el punto de vista de cualquier proyecto civilizatorio que cupiera pensar. O sea, de hecho, desde mi punto de vista, después de la crisis ecológica, la existencia, la emergencia de esta nueva clase a nivel global es el principal problema que tenemos como humanidad planteado, pues representa la quiebra de un proyecto civilizatorio basado en la equidad, en la igualdad, en la justicia y en la libertad. Es decir, un proyecto de civilización basado en los derechos humanos y del ciudadano. Este es el punto, desde mi punto de vista, central sobre el que Guy Standing construye, digamos, su libro y su investigación, ¿no? Bien, es un libro, además, y con esto ya voy a terminar para dar paso a los otros invitados, es un libro no solamente que señala un problema central, un problema dramático, porque además, de alguna manera, todos estamos afectados por esta realidad. O sea, yo no me considero miembro del precariado. O sea, soy un profesor de universidad con un salario garantizado, pero me siento muy, no diría indirectamente, muy directamente tocado. ¿Por qué? Porque tengo hijos, porque tengo amigos, porque tengo vecinos, porque tengo conocidos, y más o menos la espada de Damocles de la caída en el precariado, pues pende de alguna manera sobre casi todos nosotros o nuestros allegados, ¿no? Y detrás de esta realidad pues hay un drama social, es decir, hay sufrimiento, hay frustración, hay estrés. O sea, de alguna manera el precariado es una masa de población heterogénea que ha dado en caer en una vida laboral, digamos, caracterizada por la intemperie. O sea, la vida laboral del precariado transcurre sin shelter, sin techo, sin protección. Entonces es una vida rodeada por incertidumbre y además sometida. ¿De acuerdo? De tal manera que el precario, dependiendo también un poco del grado de precariedad, no puede ni siquiera planificar racionalmente su vida, ¿no? Bien, termino diciendo que es un libro no solamente oportuno, no solamente que señala un problema de una gravedad tremenda, sino que es un libro sólido. O sea, es un libro desde el punto de vista científico positivo sólido. Es sólido descriptivamente, primer nivel, ¿no?, de una obra de una gran aportación. Entonces maneja una cantidad de información y organiza una cantidad de información, en fin, ingente, tanto en el plano cuantitativo como en el plano cualitativo. O sea, no solamente son estadísticas las que maneja también cantidad de entrevistas personales, experiencias de vida, de tal manera que lo que él te cuenta, pues no solamente te llega a la cabeza, te llega al corazón. Y os puedo asegurar que es un libro, yo según lo iba traduciendo, no había línea, no había página que no me fuera hundiendo más en la silla, porque es una realidad tan tangible, tan fresca, que nos afecta de una manera tan directa, que yo no caía, no dejaba de asombrarme, ¿no? Es analíticamente sólido también, no solo descriptivamente sólido, porque tiene un marco conceptual muy potente. Por ejemplo, la diferencia entre work y labor es importante, y porque además tiene hipótesis muy sólidas, ¿no?, como es la gran transformación del mundo contemporáneo y la ruptura de la ciudadanía, la transformación de nuestra condición de ciudadanos en nuestra condición de denizens, que yo he traducido, él me decía que mal traducido por residentes, pero claro, no hay un término para traducir denizen al castellano, o sea, es una especie de meteco, ¿no?, los metecos de la antigua Grecia, ¿no?, gente que tienen su estatus de ciudadanía menguado, cortado, son ciudadanos a medias, pasan por aquí, no tienen plenos derechos, son víctimas de todo tipo de vejaciones en el punto de trabajo, en el mercado de trabajo, por parte del Estado, etcétera, etcétera, ¿no? De tal manera que también es un libro analíticamente sólido, es un libro éticamente muy potente, porque claro, sus juicios de valor los fundamenta en principios éticos bien construidos. Por ejemplo, tira de Rawls, ¿no?, la elaboración que hace el principio de diferencia de Rawls, transformando el principio de diferencia en seguridad, o el principio de trabajo digno, o el principio de contención ecológica. De tal manera que, como veis, descriptiva, analítica, ético-normativamente es un libro muy sólido. Y ya para colmo, Guy Standing se atreve a proponernos una agenda. Bueno, en última instancia, claro, es un hombre que está preocupado, o sea, que esto de los principios morales y lo de, en fin, que esto es una cosa muy mala y sus juicios de valor son porque este señor es un hombre sensible que está sinceramente preocupado por esto. Entonces, ¿qué hacer, no? Y se atreve a hacer una propuesta muy potente, muy variada, muy rica, muy fresca también, con la que podemos estar en unas cosas más de acuerdo con otras, porque es una propuesta para el debate, ¿no? En fin, aquí tenéis el libro. Yo os recomiendo que lo leáis y espero que os toque tanto como a mí me tocó mientras lo traducía. Por cierto, felicito realmente y sinceramente a Guy Standing por el libro y digo claramente que no solamente he disfrutado, sino que me siento honrado de haberlo traducido. Bien, pues nada, ya con esto termino. Dejo la palabra a Jorge. Ah, sí, perdona. Bien, Jorge García López es profesor de Sociología. Yes. Do you want to go first? I think it's better. You're the most important person in the answer. Okay, that's another idea. Okay. Bueno, me estaba diciendo que ahora le dé la palabra a él. Y como discussants, pues dejamos para el final a Íñigo y a Jorge. Decía que Jorge es profesor en la Universidad de Castilla-La Mancha, es doctor en Sociología y especialista en Sociología de las Relaciones Laborales. Íñigo Errejón, ¿hace falta presentar a Íñigo Errejón? Bien, Íñigo Errejón fue alumno distinguido de la Facultad de Ciencias Políticas, doctor en Ciencia Política, investigador y además pues líder muy destacado de la formación, en fin, de moda que es Podemos, ¿no? Por cierto, la idea de poner a Íñigo o a un representante de Podemos, no tenía por qué ser Íñigo, pero Íñigo amablemente ha aceptado la invitación con Guy Standing, es porque Guy Standing tenía muchas ganas de entrar en contacto con Podemos. Porque de alguna manera una de las propuestas es, bueno, el proletariado, el precariado necesita voz, también necesita representación, necesita instrumentos políticos que de alguna manera representen y luchen, ¿no? por la defensa de sus necesidades y de sus preferencias, ¿no? Entonces, bueno, esta pequeña indiscreción pues, justifica, ¿no? que Íñigo esté aquí. Bien, entonces damos la palabra a Guy Standing.
Well, first of all, I apologize for not speaking Spanish, and I hope you'll be able to follow the translation. I wasn't quite sure whether André's introduction was an obituary or a very nice tribute. I would like to thank him for the translation and for the introduction. He mentioned that I worked for a long time in the International Labour Organization, which, as those of you who don't know, is the United Nations Agency for Labour and Social Policies. Well, during the long time I worked in and around the ILO, I was thrown out of it 3 times. And I remember the Director General calling me in one time, and when I was being thrown out, and I said, why? Why? I haven't done anything. And he said, well, the employers are against you. I want re-election as Director General. And all I can say, he said, is that some people who are sinners in one century are saints in the next. So I said to him, I don't want to be a saint in any century. And it was very strange that I was invited back 3 times, but each time at a higher level than when I was thrown out. And that is the opposite of what happens to most people in the precariat. So what I'm going to do this evening, if I may, is actually introduce elements from a trilogy of books. The first book is called Work After Globalization, and was an attempt to come to terms with what I regarded as the failures of laborism in the 20th century. I found that the elevation of labor to a pedestal was fundamentally against the human spirit. And it can be epitomized by an aphorism of an economist in the 1920s. And he said, if he hires a housekeeper or a cook, national income goes up, employment goes up, economic growth goes up, and unemployment comes down. If I marry her and she continues to do exactly the same work, national income comes down, employment comes down, economic growth comes down, and unemployment goes up. Now, you can't get more stupid or sexist than that. And yet all our statistics, even today in the 21st century, ignore all the work that women mostly do, but some men. A lot of work that is done, ecological work, reproductive work, a lot of the work that we as human beings do are completely ignored. It's a very strange, warped way of looking at reality. And that book was an attempt to say, well, supposing we took a different approach and went back to the ancient Greeks and how they conceptualized work and leisure. And it tried to deal with those issues. But everywhere I went when I presented that book, and I'm now persona non grata in the ILO for writing that book, wherever I went, when I started talking about the precariat, and this is a decade ago, you could hear the pin drop. Because people, particularly young, educated people, were understanding. So I wanted to write a narrative that could be appreciated by non-economists. I'm an economist. And you risk, when you write a book like that, falling between two stools, as we say. You risk your academic colleagues saying, yes, but not enough statistics, not enough conceptual work, not enough references. And you risk the lay people, your non-specialists, saying, yeah, well, it's very interesting, but a bit too complicated for me. So you risk that. Now, the book has had a life, as Andreas mentioned, taking me all over the world, over 300 presentations, and it's evolved. But I was talking with a very famous American intellectual who endorsed the book, and I thought, well, next year, 2015, is the 800th anniversary of a pivotal document, not just in the English language, but globally, because it's the foundation of the constitution of many countries. That document was all on one page. It's the Magna Carta of 1215. And the Magna Carta was a set of demands for liberties and rights of the emerging mass class of the time. So I said to myself, well, the precariat, and I'll come to the definition and the issues in a minute, the precariat is the rising mass class of our time. What would a precariat charter look like in 2015? And how would it differ from a proletariat charter, had there been one, 100 years ago? So that's the start of the book. Now, if you're going to write a book like that, you must have a good mix of vanity and a good thirst for strong drink. Because you have to be brave, because you're going to offend somebody or many people, and you have to reach out to a different conceptual framework, a different way of looking at things that's going to offend more friends than you thought you had. So I set out to write the book that ends the trilogy. And I want to start by telling you about the context as I see it. And I think that any new progressive movement, whether it be Podemos or any other progressive movement in the 21st century, has to start with understanding the context of where we are today in the globalization story. Most of you in this room will have read Karl Polanyi's great book, The Great Transformation, which very briefly, because I don't have a lot of time, essentially said that there was a disembedded phase in the 19th century, early part of the 20th century, dominated by financial capital, the bankers of the world. And they pursued a market system, a laissez-faire system, in which the old regulatory systems, the old social protection system, the old redistributive mechanisms were dismantled until the insecurities and inequalities grew so much that there was a threat of the annihilation of civilization. And at that point, the crisis became unsustainable, or there had to be a double movement, re-embedding the economy in society with new systems of regulation, social protection, and redistribution. Notice, new, not the old. Now, Karl Polanyi lived to see the great transformation take place, so we had welfare state capitalism evolving in the 1950s, 60s, and 70s. But as we all know, it broke down, his transformation, in the 1970s and 1980s, until we had the beginnings of a global transformation. Polanyi was talking about the development of national market systems in Spain, in Britain, in France, and wherever. Today, we have been going through the disembedded phase of a global transformation, which is seeing the painful construction of a global market system. And in the process, of course, we opened up the world. We opened up Spain through a neoliberalism, which meant the liberalization of all markets, the privatization of economic and social policy, the commodification of everything that can be commodified. And most importantly, for understanding my narrative, which has been given too little attention, I believe, the systematic dismantling of all institutions of social solidarity. All institutions that provided communities of rights and communities of development and communities of freedom, occupational communities, educational communities, the firm as a corporation that people entered and lived through a community in their firm, all have been dismantled. And this was a deliberate strategy of the neoliberal model. It wasn't an incidental outcome. It was the deliberate part. Milton Friedman, one of the architects, his very first book was about how that was necessary. Now, in the process, we have seen a growing flexibilization of labor markets, a growing openness of labor markets, and most crucially, for understanding where we are going, overnight, historically speaking, there was a quadrupling of the world's labor supply. Overnight, an extra 2 billion people became potentially part of the global labor market. And all of those extra 2 billion people were habituated to expect a life and earnings 1/50th of what a Spaniard or a British or a Swedish or an American worker would have accepted as the norm. Now, those who were developing this neoliberal dystopia, what they did is they said, well, there are going to be huge downward pressure on wages and living standards of workers when we open up to the global labor market. And of course, they could not allow wages to plunge down. So in effect, they made a Faustian bargain with all of us. The Faustian bargain said, essentially, you can have an orgy of consumption. We'll give you cheap credit, cheap mortgages, tax credits, labor subsidies, more subsidies. Enjoy it. Meanwhile, they were dismantling these institutions. And of course, like all Faustian bargains, the orgy had to come to an end. And it did in 2008. Since then, of course, every government has come in. Oh, look at the debt. Look at the debt. You've all got to tighten your belts because It's happened. They could have done something very different, but they chose not to. And now they tell us, you must have austerity. It's a big lie. But they've succeeded, and consequently, Spain has 25% unemployment, youth unemployment of over 50%, the same inequalities growing everywhere, the insecurities growing everywhere. And so we have a crisis. An ecological crisis, a fiscal crisis, an existential crisis. But meanwhile, in the last 30 years, we have a new class structure that has been superimposed on old class structures. A globalized class structure. On the top is a plutocracy, not the top 1%. It's the top 0.001%. That are powerful individuals that stride the globe as global citizens. They dominate everywhere. A long way below them is an elite that earns most of their income from capital. They hope to go into the plutocracy. A long way below them is a salariat who have still got employment security. They've got salaries, they've got pensions, they've got paid holidays, paid maternity leave, paid paternity leave. More golf club memberships than they can use. Their numbers are shrinking too, but they were expected to become the majority 20, 30 years ago. Underneath, but only just, is a growing group of what I call proficients. They don't want employment security. They make a lot of money through projects, rushing around the world with their mobiles of this, that, and the other. Their only problem is burnout at age 29 and a half, when they suddenly collapse of some sort. A long way below them is the old proletariat. Now, the proletariat was defined by being oriented as a norm to a life of stable labor, full-time labor, in blocks of time. You went to school, 30 years of stable, full-time labor, or living as a wife of someone doing stable full-time labor, 2 years of retirement, drop dead. Blocks of time. They were habituated, proletarianized to accept that life, and therefore saw jobs and labor as the nirvana. I'm slightly oversimplifying, but only slightly. It's below them that the precariat has been growing, and below the precariat, a lumpen precariat, the underclass who are out in the streets of Madrid or London or anywhere else, holding out a hat if they've got one to get a penny or two from any of us. The precariat is not an underclass. The precariat is wanted by multinational capital, it's wanted by the neoliberal project, and consists of millions and millions of people who can be defined in 3 dimensions that mean that it is a class. The first dimension is that relations of production are distinctive. The precariat is being habituated, regulated in such ways that the state wants it to accept unstable labor and unstable living as the norm. That's the first part. So you get casualization, temporaries, all the part-time, etc., etc. Now, most commentators define the precariat in those terms. For me, that's only one small part of the precariat and the least intellectually interesting part. More importantly, people in the precariat have no occupational identity, no occupational narrative that they can give to their lives. I am becoming something. I'm becoming a professor. I'm becoming a doctor. If you're in the precariat, you can't do that. You don't have any security of identity in occupational terms. But in addition to that, the precariat has to do a lot of work for labor that does not get counted. Retraining, networking, applying for jobs, waiting around, doing this, a bit of that, a bit of that, a bit of that, a bit of that. So people in the precariat have lost control of their own time. And they suffer from what I call in the books the precariatized mind. You don't know what's the optimum way to use your time. And in addition to that, this is the first class in history whose level of education is above the level of labor that they're expected to perform. It's never happened before. And this creates a real status frustration inside the precariat. The second dimension, and I'm being brief to try to get the story clear, the second dimension is that the precariat has distinctive relations of distribution. What that means is that they have to rely almost entirely on money wages for their income. They don't get access to those enterprise non-wage benefits, the pensions, etc. They don't get access to rights-based state benefits. They don't get access to community benefits that in the past provided an informal system of support in times of crisis. And consequently, the problem for the precariat is living a life of chronic uncertainty. Uncertainty, which Rumsfeld defined as unknown unknowns. I hope that can be translated. But unknown unknowns means you can't have insurance. You can't know what to do in advance because you can be hit at any time. And in addition, because the state has been reformed in such a way that benefits, state benefits, are increasingly means tested and behavior tested, because if you target only on the poor, then you have to say, well, only the deserving poor, because you may choose to be poor, so we have to have behavior tests to check whether you're poor because of your own fault or because you're lazy. So more and more the state has created an edifice of means tests and behavior tests. And what does that do? It puts the precariat in what we call poverty traps. A poverty trap arises them if you go from low benefits that you've spent a lot of time getting into a low-wage job that is only temporary and casual. You will find that you face a marginal tax rate of 80%, 90%, maybe more than 100%, because you lose the benefits and you gain a little extra in wage income. 80% tax rate. In Germany, it's 85%. Now, they tell us we must provide incentives and therefore have low taxes for capital. Capital must only pay 20% corporation tax. The middle classes must only pay 30 or 40% because we want to encourage them to work and save and invest. Meanwhile, down here, the precariat is facing 80%. That's the reality. But in addition, you have what I call in the books the precarity trap. If you lose your job tomorrow, do you think the day after you will start receiving your benefits? If so, you have a shock coming. It turns out that millions of Europeans, when they become entitled to benefits, spend not days, not weeks, but months waiting before they start receiving them. Now, supposing you've just about started receiving your benefits, and then along comes an employment official saying you have to take a part-time temporary job the other side of Madrid. Would you think it rational to accept such a job? Because very quickly you could be unemployed again and have to queue up and start applying for your benefits. So instead of an 80% tax rate, you could actually end up losing by taking that part-time job. It's that sort of thing that is happening to the precariat all the time. And they understand it. And the third definition, part of the definition, is that the precariat has distinctive relations to the state. And what that means is that they are, in English, the term I use from the Middle Ages, they are denizens, not citizens. I describe what that means in the books, but essentially this is the first class in history consisting of people who are losing civil rights. They're losing social rights, they're losing cultural rights, they're losing political rights, and they're losing economic rights. It's never happened before. And so in the end, the ultimate defining characteristic of being in the precariat is that you are a supplicant. You are somebody who, rather than having rights, has to please other people, has to ask, has to beg, has to satisfy some bureaucrat, make friends that you don't really want to make because you might need them to help you. This sense of being a supplicant is part of the condition of the precariat. Now, I won't go further on the definition because I must get quickly to the end point. But today's precariat is a dangerous class, the subtitle of the first book, because of two things. It is internally divided, at war with itself, and it is rejecting all the old mainstream center-left, center-right political establishment. Because, as the saying goes, my dreams are not in your ballot box. That wonderful piece of graffiti that the Indignados developed, and others, the Occupy movement. And what is happening, and very important for the politics going forward, is that the precariat is currently divided into three factions. The first faction consists of people who have fallen out of old working class communities and traditions and occupations. Their parents were dockers or shipbuilders or miners or car manufacturers or whatever. They can't be anything like that. But they do not have a lot of education. So they tend to look backwards and be atavists. And they listen to the voices of the far right, of the neo-fascist populists, who play on their fears and say your insecurity is due to the migrants, to the Roma, to the women, the disabled, to the Muslims, or some other group that they can pluck from the air. And that part of the precariat is going to the far right in every country of Europe and the United States and Japan. The second part of the precariat consists of the migrants, the Roma, the minorities. They tend to keep their heads down, but every time the state becomes too oppressive, there are days of rage like there were in Stockholm last year when arson and breakouts take place. And the third part consists of the educated, mostly young, ecologists, many women, many people with disabilities, who are not drawn to the far right, but they don't see a politics of paradise in the political establishment they see around them. They suffer from status frustration because they went to university or college and were promised a career. They were promised a good life of security and the ability to develop their capabilities through their life. And they know when they came out of university, they bought a lottery ticket that is costing more and more and has lower and lower probability of being a winning ticket. And all they have is debt and frustration. And this part of the precariat is growing today and is the part that new progressive political movements must orient their thinking towards. Now, to go forward slightly, Those of you who know Polanyi's great transformation should recognize that we are at a crisis point and remember the following three principles. For a new progressive movement forward, it has to be based on the insecurities and aspirations of the emerging mass class. That's the first principle. The second principle is that for any new forward march, there have to be new forms of collective action. New forms, not the old forms. And the third and crucial principle is that for any new forward march against this dystopia that has emerged, has to involve three overlapping struggles. The first struggle is a struggle for recognition, a struggle for identity. Because unless you can recognize yourself as part of a social group, you cannot develop the strength and the agency to oppose the structures that are causing your insecurities and the inequalities around you. And I think the events of 2011 and since, with the Occupy movements, the Indignado, the Arab Spring, and all the other protest movements, have made a huge contribution to a sense of recognition. A sense in which, instead of looking in the mirror in the morning or in a public toilet, when you look in that mirror, you see a failure. That was what we were looking at in 2008, 2009, 2010. Now, more and more people, when they look in the mirror, they say, I'm not a failure. I'm part of a social group. And our experience is because of the structures around us, with dynamics taking place. And in that, I give myself strength. I get strength. That is a wonderful move forward, and that, I think, is why people like the Podemos, the M5M movement in Italy, the Syriza in Greece, and other movements, they're tapping into that sense of identity. And they would be fools if they forgot that. The second struggle is a struggle for representation, a struggle for the voice, the collective voice of the precariat to be in every part of the state. Every agency, the unions, the institutions, the social agencies, the activist groups. We haven't made a lot of progress there yet. A political agenda has to address that. New forms of associational freedom. And the third principle is that for every new forward march towards a revival of the great trinity of égalité, liberté, et fraternité, every new forward march involves a struggle for redistribution. But a redistribution of what? We can't go back to the old socialist project of 100 years ago. If you talk about redistributing the means of production to a group in the precariat in any country I've been to, they'll be mostly rushing for the nearest bar to get a drink. That doesn't resonate. Doesn't resonate. Whether you like it or not, it doesn't resonate. What does resonate? It's a struggle for the redistribution of the crucial assets that the precariat lacks and that it needs to make for a good life. What are those assets? Well, first of all is security, economic security. The maldistribution, the inequality of security is much greater in our societies than the inequality of income. If you're up here, you have total security in every way. If you're down in the precariat, you have no security at all. None. So we need a strategy for the redistribution of security. The second and related asset is control of time. Again, if you're up here, you can have plenty of control of your time. If you're down in the precariat, you have no control of your time. The maldistribution of control over time is terrible. We need a politics of time. The third asset is quality space. And this means we need a fight for the commons. Because the precariat depends on the commons, the social commons, the geographical commons, the electronic commons, to a greater extent than any other group in society. And yet the neoliberal agenda has been privatizing the commons. Privatizing and turning them into profit centers, taking away public space, taking away Getty Park, taking away the museums and the sources of popular art. And we need a struggle for that. The next key asset is financial knowledge. Again, it's maldistributed. We need a struggle for the redistribution and access to financial knowledge. And finally, we need a struggle for the redistribution of capital. Because the 20th century income distribution system has broken down.